The bottle I refused to serve was a 15-year Scotch that cost more than my car, requested by a man who had the kind of face that expects compliance as a matter of physics. Not aggression, nothing as crude as aggression, just the expectation, built into the bones, that what he asked for would arrive, and I set it back behind the bar and looked him in the eye and said, "I'm sorry, sir, that particular bottle isn't available tonight." It was available. He could see it. The whole room could see it, sitting right there on the back bar shelf, where I'd put it when I moved it from the private room. The man's eyes went to the bottle and came back to me and the calculation he was running. What is happening here? Is this woman serious? What is she going to say next? Was visible in his face in the way calculations are visible in the faces of men who aren't used to being told no by someone like me. "I was told it was set aside for the table," he said. "I understand, sir. I apologize for the confusion. Can I get you something while I find the manager?" What I got him was a bourbon in 8 minutes and, as it turned out, exactly the amount of time the Admiral needed to walk through the door. But I'm not going to start there. I want to start where it actually started, which is earlier that evening, in a private dining room, in a moment that lasted maybe 4 seconds and that I've been turning over ever since. My name is Danny Okafor. I'm 24 years old, and I worked the evening service at the Meridian Officers Club on a Navy base for 2.5 years, and this is the story of the one night all of that time meant something more than a good memory for drink orders. This is also a story about what 2.5 years of being furniture in a room full of powerful people actually teaches you, which is more than anyone in those rooms would be comfortable admitting, and about the strange quiet shape of what you get for using it. First, you need to understand the Meridian, because the Meridian is not a restaurant and it's not exactly a bar, and the way it functions matters to everything else. Officers' clubs exist in a space between the formal and the informal that civilians don't quite have a frame for. Senior military personnel, defense contractors, the occasional visiting official, they come to the Meridian to be off the record, which means officially they're relaxing and unofficially they're working, and the line between those two things in a building like that is thinner than the people doing the work are usually willing to admit. The conversations happen over dinner that couldn't happen in a conference room. The handshakes happen over drinks that formalize the things decided in the conference room. I'd watched this process for 2.5 years and I understood it the way you understand the climate of a place you've lived in long enough to feel it on your skin. And the people who serve in those buildings, who carry the food, pour the drinks, clear the plates, are the furniture of that process, which means they see the whole of it, from every angle, while being seen by almost none of it. I worked the evening service at the Meridian. I'd taken the job at 22 after a degree I hadn't been able to afford to finish and a few years of working places that didn't seem to lead anywhere. And I'd stayed because the pay was better than most things available to me and the work suited a person who moves well and observes well and doesn't require a lot of external recognition to do the job right. I also stayed because I'd gotten good at it in a specific way. Not good in a way anyone complimented, good in a way nobody noticed, which in that building amounted to the same thing. I'm good at this job the way I'm good at most things I do with my body, and not my ego. Quietly, without making it a performance, without needing anyone to notice. I have a good memory for orders and a temper I've trained into something that looks like perfect composure over 2.5 years of practice, which is a different thing from not having one. And I have been overhearing the conversations of powerful people since I was 22 without ever once feeling like the things I heard were mine to judge. People in authority say things in front of the service staff. They say the small things, the personal things, the things that make them human and that they'd never say if they remembered we were listening. They also sometimes say the things they shouldn't. I had developed a very sophisticated personal policy of letting all of it flow through me and away, like water through a strainer, and going home and sleeping fine. The thing that held my policy together was a simple truth I'd confirmed over thousands of hours of service in that building. What I overheard was not my business, not because I didn't care, but because I had no jurisdiction over it. These were senior officers in defense, contractors, and visiting officials, and I was the girl with the glass. And in the hierarchy of that building there was no version of I heard something that ended with me being listened to instead of laughed out of the room, or quietly reassigned. I'd made my peace with that limitation years before the night it stopped being true. The night it all changed, I was working a small private dining event. 6 men, 1 long table, a booking through the private function service that I'd been assigned to handle alone. Defense contractors and 2 Navy officers. This happens, it's a normal thing at the Meridian, a normal use of the private room. I'd served 20 of these. I'd come on shift at 5 that Thursday evening with no reason to expect anything different from any other Thursday. The private function had been booked 2 weeks out. The setup was standard. The guest list had been processed through the club's normal channels. 6 attendees, 2 of them holding security. Clearances I had no knowledge of beyond the fact that the form I'd signed when I started working at the Meridian required me to treat everything I encountered as above my clearance level. That form is the legal architecture underneath what I did that night and underneath the way I'd been living in that building for 2.5 years. The acknowledgement that the conversations were not mine to carry, which meant I'd spent years training myself to hear things and put them down immediately, to let them pass through and away without holding them, the way you put down something hot before it burns. It also meant that when I held something, When I found myself at the kitchen sink with a thing I could not put down no matter how many reasonable explanations I tried, I knew what that meant. I'd been putting things down for 2.5 years. This was the first time one of them burned. I'd worked there for 2.5 years and I'd served maybe 20 private functions in that room, and the routine of it had a particular rhythm. Arrivals, drinks, appetizers, the working dinner, dessert, after dinner drinks, and the conversation that only happens once the food is done. And I'd been inside that rhythm so many times that I could feel when it was wrong in the same way you feel a stare that isn't where you expected it. That night the rhythm was wrong before I could say how. The two quiet men had a quality that the other quiet men I'd served in that room never had, which was alertness. They were paying close attention to each other in the specific controlled way of people who are managing what they say rather than saying it. I noticed this the way I noticed everything in that building, peripherally, without acting on it, filed away in the part of my brain that took inventory without making judgments, filed away, until it wasn't filed away anymore. The 6 men were deep into their 3rd hour of dinner when it happened. Long table, 6 chairs, the kind of private room that the Meridian had specifically for events that were meant to feel removed from the main dining area. Separate entrance from the service corridor. No windows facing the main floor, its own sound envelope. I was working at solo, which was standard for private events of this size. One person can manage 6 if the event has been set up properly and the service is timed well. And this one was, and I had been moving cleanly through the evening doing what I'd been trained to do, which was be present and invisible in equal measure. The table had reached the stage of a long dinner where the event itself is over, and what's left is the working, the real working, the conversations that start in the spaces between the food, and the men had divided themselves, the way they always do, the important 4 at one end, and the other 2 a little apart at the other. And I was clearing from the far end, the quiet end, the 2 who had pulled slightly back. Which is why I was there, and why I heard it, and why neither of them noticed me hearing it. Mav. I'm not going to tell you exactly what I heard, because some of it is still in front of lawyers and I've been told, explicitly, what I can and cannot say publicly. What I'll tell you is what shape it had, and what it did to me when I heard it. It was about a person, not present. A name I'm not going to use here, a Navy officer, from the way they spoke of him, and the word they used, repeated twice, casual as weather, was sorted. And then a sentence I'm going to give you, because it's not classified, it's just words. If he's sorted before the review board, the contract clears and nobody's asking the questions he was going to ask. And then a laugh, and a nod at the bottle of scotch on the side table, the 15-year, the good one, set aside for their table. And the other man saying, make sure it gets to him tonight then, finish the evening properly. I was holding a stack of cleared plates and I kept holding them and I kept my face exactly where it always was. Professional, neutral, slightly forward, the expression I'd practiced into a default over 2.5 years of standing next to conversations that weren't mine. And I walked to the kitchen and I set the plates down, and I stood at the sink with the water running and the sound covering whatever I might have let out. Sorted. If he's sorted before the review board. Make sure the bottle gets to him tonight. Let me tell you what those 3 sentences did to me, slowly, standing at that sink. The first thing was disbelief. Not the honest kind, the wishful kind, the kind that says I didn't hear what I think I heard. The volume was high and I was moving and I was on the wrong side of a floral arrangement, and the brain is very good at generating pattern from noise. I stood at that sink and I worked through every explanation for what I might have misheard, the way you do when you're hoping for a version of events that lets you go home without doing anything difficult. I came up with several. None of them worked for more than a few seconds before the flat specific texture of what I'd actually heard pushed them back out. Here is the thing about being a person who overhears things for a living. You develop a feel for the difference between men performing significance and men transacting it. Performance is loose and round and enjoys itself, repeats for effect. Transaction is flat and quick, moves through the subject like it's already done, and gets on to logistics. What I'd heard had been transaction, sorted, before the review board, tonight. Those were logistics. The only question was what they were logistics for. Oh, I also had no proof. I had a position on the wrong side of a long table, partially obscured, serving men with clearances I didn't hold, who would say they'd been talking about something else entirely and would be believed without effort, because they were them and I was me. I had a feeling and a half-overheard sentence and a bottle of scotch that I could see through the pass to the private room, sitting on the side table where it had been set up for the table's after-dinner course. And the man it was meant for was somewhere in this building, expected to arrive within the hour. And the man it was meant for was somewhere in this building. Before I tell you what I did and didn't do over the next 90 minutes, I want to stop and ask you something honestly, because this is where the story gets real for me and I don't want you to miss it. Has there ever been a moment where you knew something? Not proved it, knew it in the unreliable human way where the evidence is thin and the certainty is irrational and you're going to sound insane if you say it out loud. And the thing you knew had a cost attached to acting on it that you could not easily afford. where the safe move was to let it go because you had no proof and you had everything to lose, and you are a 24-year-old waitress and they are decorated officers and contractors with 40 years of standing between them and the sentence you overheard from behind a floral arrangement? Tell me in the comments, because I read them, and I want to know whether you let it go, and whether you're still carrying that decision. And subscribe now if you want to hear how this ends, because the ending is worth it. Here is what I did. I went back to the private room and I cleared the rest of the table, and I smiled, and I asked if anyone needed anything, and nobody looked at me because I was furniture. And I went back to the main bar and I thought, I couldn't call someone. Who was I calling? I had overheard half a sentence and inferred murder, and that word in my head at that moment felt too large and too clean for what I actually had, which was 3 sentences heard in a noisy room that could have innocent explanations I was too tired and too scared to generate. And I worked at a Navy base where the correct reporting channel for a concern of this kind was a chain of command that ran through, quite possibly, people connected to the same table I'd just been serving. The club manager, Hicks, would listen to me with the specific patience he reserved for situations he'd already decided were misunderstandings. The base security non-emergency line would take a report that would be routed somewhere, and my name would go with it, and before anything could be verified, the evening would be over. A formal report through any channel I had access to was going to be too slow, too visible, and too unlikely to be believed by anyone who could act on it in time. What I could do was not move the bottle. That was in my jurisdiction. That was a decision I could make alone, without a chain of command, without evidence, without a report filed in my name, and it was the only decision that could hold the line until something else happened, and I had no idea if something else was going to happen. But the bottle staying where it was cost me nothing except the anger of a man who expected the bottle to move, and I could afford a man's anger, and I could not afford the alternative. I also needed to know who the bottle was for, the name. If I had the name, and if things went wrong, if nothing happened and the evening concluded and I was left holding a quiet certainty that no one was ever going to act on, at least I'd have written something down. I did the thing I always do when I need information in that building without asking for it. I listened. I found reasons to be near the edges of conversations, a napkin holder at the end of the bar that didn't need restocking, a candle that needed adjusting. And over the next 40 minutes I gathered, from the ambient noise of men who never look at the furniture, the name of the officer expected to join the table. I heard the 2 initials of one of the men at the table said in a context that connected him to the hive contractor. I wrote both on a cocktail napkin, folded it, and put it in my apron pocket where my order pad usually was. It was the smallest possible version of a record, on a napkin in a pocket, but it was real and it was mine, and if something happened I would have it. If nothing happened I would go home and throw it away and not know what to believe about the night I'd had. And then I set the bottle back behind the bar, and I waited. The VIP came in at 9:30, came directly to the bar while the others were still at the table, the way men do when they're late and want a drink before they sit down, and he said, to me, with the ease of someone who has ordered in rooms like this all his life, I believe there's a bottle of the 15-year set aside for the table tonight. And he looked over my shoulder at the bar and found it with his eyes, and I put my hand on the bar, not on the bottle, and I said, I'm sorry sir, that particular bottle isn't available tonight. And I watched his face do what faces do when something inconvenient is happening, which was arrange itself in preparation to push back. I was told it was set aside. I understand, sir. I apologize for the confusion. Can I offer you something else while I get the manager? He looked at me. Men look at me a specific way when I tell them no, a way that is really looking at the idea that no has been said by this particular person, and processing what that means. Who told you it wasn't available? It's an availability issue with that particular bottle tonight. I'm sorry, sir. What can I get you? What I got him was a bourbon, a good one, the kind you give when you've taken something away, the gracious substitution. And I set it in front of him and said I'd locate the manager, and I watched him decide whether this was worth pressing. And it wasn't. Not yet. Not in front of the room. And he picked up the bourbon. That bought me 8 minutes. 8 minutes while the Admiral walked, from wherever he'd been to the Meridian's main entrance. 8 minutes that I used to get the bar between me and the private room, to reposition the bottle somewhere less visible on the back shelf, and to think through what was going to happen when the manager arrived and asked me to explain the unavailability of a bottle that was clearly available. I had no explanation that would work with Hicks. I had no explanation that would work with anyone in that building that night who wasn't the people who came through the side door later. And I had no way of knowing those people were coming, or that the Admiral was coming, or that any of this was going to resolve the way it resolved rather than with me being the waitress who made a scene about a bottle and was asked to leave. 8 minutes of holding a line I wasn't sure was real. And then the main door opened and the room reorganized itself around the thing that walked through it, and everything changed. I didn't know who he was in the first second. I knew he was very senior from the way the room around him rearranged, the instantaneous social reorganization that happens when a certain level of authority enters a space. Conversations pausing mid-sentence, people turning without knowing why they were turning, the posture of the room changing. Then I registered the rank insignia and the way the 2 officers from the private table had gone very still, and I registered that the man who'd walked in was moving across the meridian with the walk of a man who had been given information recently that made him angry and purposeful, and that his eyes, when they swept the room, were not casual. I recognized what I was seeing because I'd learned to read that building. This was not a social entrance. This was a man who had been told he needed to be somewhere, and was now here, and was looking for the people who'd required him to be. Across the room, the two men from the private table, the ones I'd heard, had gone the specific color that powerful people go when something they believed was handled has turned out not to be handled. It's a color I'd never seen in that building before. I saw it then. They looked at the Admiral, and they looked at each other, and then they looked at the bar, where the bottle of 15-year Scotch was still sitting behind it, where I'd put it back, where it had not moved. And then the Admiral looked at the bar too, and then he looked at me. What passed between us in that second I'm not going to dramatize, because I don't fully know what it was. I think he was doing the same thing I'd been doing all evening, which was reading a room he knew well and noticing what was different, and what was different was the bottle sitting behind the bar instead of in front of his place. I think he understood more in that second than I understood he understood. I think, later I came to believe that the Admiral's arrival had not been an accident, that he had been told something before he walked through that door, and that the bottle's position confirmed something he needed confirmed, and that the person standing behind the bar between the bottle and the table was the reason for the confirmation. But I didn't know any of that then. I just held his gaze for 1 second, and he held mine, and then he turned toward the table, and the evening changed. He crossed the room to the two men, and said something I couldn't hear, and the room went the kind of quiet that a sound being turned off at the wall makes, where the absence of the sound is louder than the sound itself had been. The other four men at the table drew back the way people draw back when they understand they're about to witness something they should not witness. And then two people I'd never seen before came through the side entrance of the Meridian. Not base security, not club staff, nobody who was supposed to be there, and went directly to the table. And the evening for those two men ended there, in the Meridian Officers Club, on a Thursday night, in front of a room of witnesses who'd all been looking somewhere else 60 seconds earlier, and were now looking at nothing else. The bottle went with the people who came through the side door. I watched that happen. One of them put it in a bag with gloves, and the other one had a clipboard, and I stood behind the bar holding nothing, and knowing I'd been right. From the sink, from the half sentence, from the specific flat texture of two men transacting something that wasn't mine to hear. What came next was a back office and a long table, and people who didn't give their names, and me with a cocktail napkin unfolded between us and 2.5 years of practice at telling the truth precisely. I told them about the overheard sentences in the order I'd heard them, with the words I was confident of and the words I was less confident of separated clearly. I told them about the 40 minutes of listening at the edges of the room, the napkin, the two initials, the name, what I'd done with the bottle, and why. The woman across the table listened the way good listeners listen, which is without moving, and when I was done she said, "How did you know to write it down?" I said what was true. I'd spent 2.5 years in rooms where things get said in front of the furniture, and I had learned that if you have information and your word is going to be disputed, which it will be, your handwriting on a napkin is harder to dismiss than your word alone. She nodded and said thank you, and put the napkin in a bag with gloves, and I went home at 1:30 in the morning, and sat in my kitchen and did not sleep for a long time. I also did not call anyone. I'd been told clearly what I could and couldn't say, and I was by then a person who had spent 2.5 years not saying things that weren't hers to say, so I went back to work on Friday, and the Meridian was the Meridian, and nobody who wasn't there Thursday knew anything had changed. The lab results, the trial date, the contract audit, all of that came later and through channels that weren't mine, and I found out the pieces I was entitled to find out across several subsequent conversations over several months. The amount in the bottle was specific, that word again, not experimental, not incidental, specific, the amount of a calculation. The review board met on Monday. The Admiral testified. The contract did not clear. Two men who'd sat at a long table in the private room on a Thursday evening are going to answer for what was in that bottle and what was behind the contract and what specific means, and I will not be in the courtroom when they do. What I needed was for the bottle not to move. It didn't move. That's the whole story. The man whose initials I'd written on the napkin, the one I'd heard say make sure the bottle gets to him tonight, had a relationship with the defense contractor whose $80 million procurement contract the Admiral had been auditing and preparing to question. The review board was on Monday. The Admiral was the only officer senior enough and credible enough that his testimony would matter. Sorted, used the way they'd used it, had meant exactly what I'd thought it meant behind the floral arrangement, which was nothing good. I gave the napkin to the people in the back office, the two initials and the name I'd written, in my handwriting, on a cocktail napkin from the Meridian's bar stock. It was the only evidence I had. It was corroborating evidence for something they were already beginning to build, and it turned out it was the piece that put one initial together with a specific conversation at a specific time that other sources had been trying to place. I can't tell you the details of the legal outcome because some of it is still protected, and I've been told what I can say, so I'll tell you the shape of it. The procurement contract was frozen pending a full audit. The man whose initials I'd written spent some time being questioned by people much more senior than the ones who talked to me. The review board met, and the Admiral testified, and the contract did not clear. There is a trial date somewhere in the future, and I am not going to be in the courtroom, which was part of the arrangement. Here is the complicated thing I want to tell you. The thing that doesn't make the story cleaner but makes it true. Nobody gave me a medal. Nobody is going to give me a medal, because the whole point of what I did was that it was invisible. An unavailability. A bottle that didn't move. A napkin with 2 initials. The credit for what happened that night belongs, in the official version, to the Admiral and the people who came through the side door. And that's right, because they're the ones who could do something with the information once it was confirmed. I'm the one who held the line long enough for them to get there. What I got was a commendation I'm not allowed to show anyone, signed by someone whose rank I recognized and whose name I won't say here, that says, in language that is formal and measured and careful in the way legal language is careful, that I demonstrated extraordinary situational judgment in service of the integrity of a federal investigation. I have it in a drawer. I take it out sometimes, not for the words but for the proof that the night was real, that the certainty I was too frightened to fully trust turned out to be correct, that the 30 seconds at the sink with the water running was not paranoia but a competence I'd built so slowly I hadn't recognized it as competence until it cost me something to use it. I also got a phone call, about 3 weeks after, from the base legal office. A JAG officer named Sims, who had been briefed on what I'd done and how I'd documented it, and who asked me, carefully and without preamble, whether I'd ever considered a career in law. Not as a thank you, not as a gift, as a question about what I was doing with a mind that could overhear a half sentence from behind a floral arrangement and correctly parse the legal implications of it in real time. Document the relevant details on a cocktail napkin before anyone knew there was anything to document, and then hold a line for 2 hours with no authority and no proof, on nothing but a certainty she couldn't fully articulate, until the thing resolved into evidence. I told Sims I'd thought about law school the way you think about things you've told yourself you can't have, with a specific kind of longing that becomes its own habit, a door you keep touching the handle of without opening because you've decided you can't afford what's on the other side. Sims said there was a program. She explained what it was. I looked into it. I'm in it now. I still work the evening service at the Meridian on the weekends. I like the building, and I like the work, and I have not, at any point in the last year, been the kind of person who abandons the place that made her because something better came along. But I'm also studying, and I'm also building something I couldn't have named 18 months ago, and the napkin in the drawer, or the memory of it, since it's in evidence somewhere, and what I have is a photograph I took of it before I gave it over, is the origin point of all of it. Not the commendation, not the phone call, the napkin. The moment I wrote 2 initials on a piece of bar stock and folded it into my apron pocket and decided that if I was going to have this knowledge I was going to have it somewhere real. That's the whole story of what I got for being the person who didn't let the bottle move. A piece of paper I can't show anyone, a career I couldn't have imagined, and the specific permanent knowledge that the night I stood at a sink with the water running and the wrong kind of certainty in my hands, I made the right call. I lived in the version of Thursday that I could live with. That turns out to be worth more than I can say. The situations where you have the least power are not the situations where you have no power. They're the situations where the power you have is very small and very specific. And the whole game, the whole thing, is knowing what it is and not reaching beyond it and not underselling it. I couldn't report those men. I couldn't make anyone in that building believe me with what I had. I couldn't put a name into any channel I had access to without it going somewhere that would make things worse before they got better. What I could do was control one object, in one location, in one moment. That was the full extent of my jurisdiction. But it was mine, completely mine. Exercised cleanly, documented on a napkin, and held for 2 hours without anyone knowing I was holding it. No. I spent a long time, in the months after, trying to figure out what to call what I did. It wasn't heroism. Heroism is a word for dramatic things, and what I did was not dramatic, it was technical. It wasn't whistleblowing. I didn't blow anything. I moved a bottle and wrote 2 initials on a napkin and stayed in my station until the station resolved. What it was, I think, was the fullest possible use of the specific authority I actually had, without pretending to authority I didn't have, and without abandoning the authority I did. That's a small thing. It's also the only thing that worked. Jurisdiction. Right now, you do. Some small specific action that is yours and only yours because nobody else is standing where you're standing when it matters. It probably won't look like anything from the outside. It will look like a bottle not moving, a napkin folded into a pocket, a decision made in 30 seconds at a sink with the water running. But it might be the piece that holds the line long enough for the thing to resolve.
So tell me in the comments, what are you standing in?
Front of right now that nobody else is in position to hold. And if you know what it is, do it, document it, and hold it. That's the whole instruction. That's all I had. It was enough.
I still work the evening service at the Meridian on weekends. I like the building and I like the work, and I am not the kind of person who leaves a place just because the place became the place where something happened. The Meridian is where I learned what I'm good at, and it would be strange to walk away from
that now that I know what it was worth. But I'm also studying, for the first time in years with somewhere specific to go, and the person I'm becoming is built on a foundation that started in a private dining room at the quiet end of a table, 3 feet from 2 men who didn't think I was worth watching. That's where it started. The furniture end, where the real things always happen. So tell me in the comments, and I mean it, I read them, what's the thing inside your specific jurisdiction right now that you could do and haven't? Not the big confrontation, not the dramatic moment, the small precise action that's yours and only yours, the bottle you could not move, the napkin you could write on. If you know what it is, do it, document it, and hold it until something resolves. That's the whole instruction. That's all I had. It was enough.